The wind rolled hot and heavy across the high desert that afternoon, dragging dust behind it like a ghost that refused to stop wandering, and John Mercer felt every whisper of it against his skin as he rode his tired horse down the lonely trail toward the trading post he called a town, though it was really no more than 3 buildings pretending to be civilization, and he had no interest in anything except a jug of water and maybe silence, the kind that didn't ask questions and didn't remind him of things he'd done that felt too heavy to carry anymore. But fate, as it always did in the West, had different plans for a worn-out cowboy who thought he'd already seen everything, because just past the dried riverbed he saw a wagon, broken and leaning like a wounded creature, with one woman working against the wheel as though she'd been fighting alone for hours, her brown skin catching sunlight, her long dark braid falling over her shoulder, her clothes torn and dusty but her posture proud and unbroken. And he knew instantly she was Apache, but he also knew she was alone and stranded, and danger tended to find women in that condition long before help ever did. So he pulled the reins, hesitated, then called out in the gentlest voice a man like him could manage, "Need a hand, ma'am?" And she turned, not startled but ready, like someone who had learned young that wolves didn't always announce themselves before teeth met flesh, and her eyes met his with suspicion, calculation, and something like exhaustion. But she didn't answer until several slow seconds passed. Wheel broke, axle splintered. "I cannot lift it alone," and her English was clipped but clear, practiced but not surrendered. And John nodded, dismounted, and walked forward with empty hands and a posture that said he came in peace, because he'd been alive long enough to know that tribes did not forget disrespect, and the West did not forgive stupidity. Together they worked in the heat, patches of silence long enough to swallow a man whole, while he used strength she lacked and she used knowledge he didn't have, telling him where to brace, how to wrap, what wood could hold pressure until she reached her destination, and every so often she'd steal a glance at him as though trying to decide whether he was foolish, dangerous, or merely lonely. And maybe he was a bit of all three, but none of it mattered because the job came first and the desert demanded teamwork, whether people liked it or not. Eventually, with sweat pouring and arms aching, the wheel sat straight again, and the wagon stood ready for travel, and she let out the smallest exhale that sounded more like relief than gratitude. But she then turned and faced him with an upright dignity that felt almost regal, placing her hand over her heart as she said, "I honor you for this," and he bowed his head slightly, because men who helped women didn't need medals, though no one ever told him that being thanked like that could make a warrior's heart soften in the strangest way. And she reached into her pack, offering a leather pouch. "Dried meat. Take, for your kindness." But John shook his head slowly. "You keep what you need. I ain't hungry." And she stared as though that response was foreign to her understanding of how white men behaved, then simply nodded and gathered her reins, ready to leave the moment strength returned to her tired horse. Still, before she climbed into the wagon, she said quietly, "Danger rides nearby. Men scouting. I do not know if they saw you help me. If so, they may judge you enemy." And John blinked, because he hadn't helped for reward or recognition, but he'd also never helped in a situation that might cost him his scalp. So he replied with a shrug masked in bravery, "I ain't scared of men with paint on their faces." But she shook her head. "Not warriors, renegades. They do not fight for honor." And that chilled him more than he would ever admit, because renegades didn't have rules, and death wasn't personal, it was sport. Yet before he could ask more, she rode away, her wagon creaking, her braid whipping in the wind, leaving him in a cloud of dust and a sense of foreboding that followed him all the way home, because something told him that simple kindness had just set fire to a quiet life. And that night, in his small cabin built of rough-cut pine, John made coffee and tried to forget the way her eyes had looked when she spoke of danger, because a man alone, with a past heavy as iron, didn't need more trouble than he already carried. But sleep didn't come easy, and memories of battles in Mexico, raids along the border, gunfights he'd barely survived, all rose like ghosts in the dark, whispering that trouble wasn't on its way. Trouble had already seen his face. And sure enough, long before dawn, a sound broke through the stillness. Hooves, many of them circling slowly, deliberately, like predators surrounding a wounded animal. And when John stepped outside with his rifle in hand, the pale moonlight revealed silhouettes all around him, riders with long hair and painted faces, spears raised, rifles aimed, and eyes burning with a promise of violence. And one rider shouted in a fierce voice that echoed across the valley, "You helped the woman. Now you answer for what you did." And John stood alone, realizing that a simple act of human decency had turned him into a target, and fate, like the West itself, was done letting him hide from the wars he tried so damn hard to walk away from. John Mercer didn't raise his rifle immediately, because pointing a gun at a ring of mounted warriors was like lighting a match inside. A powder keg once sparked, nobody walked away unchanged, and the leader, whose chest was painted in streaks of black and red, stared with cold defiance, reins held loosely in one hand as though the horse beneath him was born of war and trained in death. And John realized with grim certainty that these men weren't here for negotiation. They weren't scouts making threats for show. They were wild dogs in human form, angry that a wandering Apache woman had received help from a white man, and furious that someone had interfered with whatever cruel fate they had planned for her. So John inhaled slowly, letting the cold morning air sharpen his mind, then said firmly, "I didn't harm her. I just fixed a wagon. Ain't a crime to help someone stranded." But the warrior scoffed, lifting his spear in a gesture that silenced his riders as though he commanded them with nothing more than a flick of muscle, and he replied in broken English, "You do not know her. She is hunted. She belongs to no tribe. She carries blood debt. Any who stand with her die with her." And the men around him rattled their weapons against saddles, eager for violence, horses snorting and stomping as though they could smell fear in the dirt. And for a moment John thought maybe he could talk his way out of this. Maybe convince them that all he wanted was peace and distance. But something in the leader's eyes told him diplomacy was as useless as water in a bullet hole, and before words could escalate into arrows, something unexpected broke the circle's rhythm. A sudden shout far away, echoing off the canyon walls, followed by 3 distant riders atop the ridge, silhouetted against the first pale sunlight, wearing different paint, different markings, different allegiance. And the leader turned his head sharply, cursed and barked a command, and the riders around John broke formation like a scattered storm, galloping toward the ridge, leaving dust clouds as heavy as thunder in their wake, while John stood in the doorway of his cabin, rifle lowered but heart pounding. And though he didn't know who the newcomers were or what side they fought for, he knew only fools stayed in the middle when tribes clashed like weather. So without hesitation he grabbed ammo, jerky, water, a blanket, and threw everything into his saddlebag with the efficiency of a man who'd practiced survival his whole life, then mounted up and rode in the opposite direction, disappearing into the timber before any rider could return. Hours passed beneath the shadows of pine and cliff, and John wondered whether helping that woman had been an accident or destiny, whether he'd simply traded silence for danger because he'd tried living alone, tried letting the world burn without him. But the West never allowed a man with a clean conscience to stay retired for long, and fate always reached back to drag him into the flames. So when he came upon a narrow stream in the canyon, he let his horse drink while his own muscles ached from tension, and he thought again about the woman, her voice steady despite exhaustion, her warning that renegades hunted her not for honor but for sport. And something tightened in his chest, because he'd seen men like that before in Mexico, soldiers without code, killers who didn't respect surrender or death, and he knew if they caught her, they wouldn't take scalps, they'd take suffering. So before he could convince himself to ignore it, he turned toward the direction she'd gone, following faint wagon tracks half erased by wind, telling himself it wasn't about duty or destiny, just debt, because a man didn't fix a wagon only to let wolves tear its passenger apart one day later. But as he tracked her into the high country, the desert gave way to mesas, and distant mesas gave way to rolling sage, and far ahead he saw smoke, thin and gray, rising from behind a cluster of boulders. And when he approached cautiously, rifle ready, he found her camp empty, torn, burned as though someone had attacked quickly and left without patience, and beside the ashes lay a strip of fabric from her dress, darkened with what might have been blood, and John's stomach twisted because he didn't know whether she had been dragged away or escaped. But either way, the worst had begun. The sun sank slowly into the western rim, bleeding colors across a sky that looked too pretty for the tragedy it witnessed, and John stood alone among the ruins, feeling the old ache of war return, the one that told him violence wasn't behind him but ahead, and he whispered to no one, "God damn it, girl. What did you get yourself into?" As if expecting the wind to answer, But the only reply was the rustle of sage, and the lonely cry of a hawk circling overhead, searching for something dying. And John knew then he couldn't turn back to the cabin. Couldn't ride back to routine. Because the moment he helped her, the moment he refused her food, the moment he looked into her eyes and saw strength instead of fear, he had stepped back into a world of conflict he swore he'd buried. So he tightened his belt, chambered his rifle, and whispered an old promise he'd made on other battlefields. If death's coming, let it find me ready. Then mounted up and rode into the deepening dusk, following prints so faint only a hunter could read them, knowing that men wearing war paint didn't chase a woman to negotiate. They chased her to destroy something sacred, and he would meet them before they finished their hunt, even if it meant his own blood watered the desert soil by morning.